What's up, Shred Sexies? Welcome back. Death to the Fingers got a request for some diminished and minor stuff. It seems like I've been doing a lot of the major things lately, and Dominant 7, you know how it is, tunnel vision and all that, so they were like more specific about minor and diminished. Of course, these are amazing sounds. You have to learn them all. So you heard me basically improvise using diminished at the very beginning, which is a combination of using the major scale and the minor pentatonic scale and diminished together. But you can hear that I can actually move diminished all over the place. I do it in B major, I do it in B minor, I do it in C sharp minor. So it's like the Swiss Army knife of the music world. So is Dominant 7 to a large degree. Think of Dominant 7 as like the major equivalent of diminished, sort of, you know, like, listen, these are guidelines more so than rules. But that's how I like to think about it, because it just keeps things very simple. So it either gives you the tension and release principle, or it creates movement in your music. If you always play melodically in the diatonic scale and not use diminished or Dominant 7, your playing kind of comes across as a bit boring, since everybody's using this stuff now. So I've gone through and basically created a minor diminished exercise, which you're going to hear right after this intro. And then I go through each one of the sections in basically autistic detail to a certain degree, with just the playing and examples, which there are quite a few of them. So dig in, start using this sound, and let's get into this lesson. All right, for the first part here, obviously we have to lay out the foundational information. So we're going to do that with respect to the minor triad, and then we're going to start messing with the minor 7 inversions on top of the minor triad. And we're also going to do the diminished triad, and then, of course, augment that up to the minor 7 flat 5. Right, so the key here to take away is notice the hierarchy of information. First, I start off by just laying out each position of each of these triad inversions, and of course, those correspond for the most part with respect to the minor 7 and the minor 7 flat 5 inversions, because those arpeggios are built off these minor triads. That's why. So these two pieces of information, they go together. So that's why you start off with just the triads, and then of course you evolve it up. Now in the case of the minor triad, you're going to have 3 positions and then 4 positions for the minor 7. But in the case of the diminished one, you're going to both have 4 positions. And you're like, what? How does that work? I'll let you figure it out. But that's a very important music rule. and I don't want to get into it now because it can get pretty complicated. But the point being here is once you start to realize this stuff, you're like, wow, okay, that's actually incredibly powerful for me to use in my learning journey, if you will, right? So as far as the lesson part is concerned, you see me break down these triads just on one string, in this case the low E string, laying out each of the positions. Then I play the inversion with respect to the triad, and then I do it again where I play the triad, and then of course I layer over top of it the minor 7 version and the minor 7 flat 5 version for the diminished, right? And you'll see me do both sequences, just all the minors and then all the diminished ones. This has to be step number one, you learning to be able to do this. You may not do the sort of dominant 7 variants, but just the standard triads, yes. And listen, I'm going to say this, sometimes you have to sit down and write this stuff out. And an even better idea is just to find a printout, if you will, of the fretboard with all the note names on it, and then just start Googling like F sharp diminished in this case, and see what the notes are, and then sit there and basically start to, you know, cross off these specific notes on the actual fretboard diagram. It'll reveal the arpeggio, and then you can just sit there and start practicing them. Going through that process of sort of figuring it out for yourself is one of the most important things you can do in terms of the learning game. This is why most people don't actually make forward gains, because you're not doing stuff like that. Believe you me, at first I was like, nah, don't want to. Then I was like, maybe I should. Then I started doing it, and then all of a sudden the playing went way up. Okay, so I can tell you from personal experience, there is no sort of substitute for sort of sitting down and being like, okay, I really need to wrap my mind around this diminished. I really need to wrap my mind around this minor triad inversions. You know, it starts at the 1st degree. There's another one at the 3rd degree. There's another one up here at the 6th degree. How does that work? And you start looking at the arpeggio form and using the, you know, the step pattern, or if you will, the scale degrees. And all of a sudden things start to make sense. So don't skip over that part. I know I'm whinging on here a little bit, but it's incredibly important, okay? And can be the difference, if you will, to going from being like just pretty good to being absolutely amazing. So I'm just putting it out there. Let's get into these examples. All right, for the second part here, essentially I use 2 supervisory ideas. I use cadences, okay, to work on synergy with respect to just 2 elements. In this case, triad arpeggios, and I use all of them, of course, diminished, major, and minor. But I also use a diatonic sequence, right? So I can listen to the synergy of one chord moving to an adjacent chord. And of course, I'm following the rules of the diatonic scale, so I'm getting some practice value there too. So starting with the cadences, obviously, I'm really working on just synergy. I don't care what the cadence is. What I care about is this sound moving to this sound. In this case, the diminished sound in the 7th degree moving to a minor triad in the 2nd degree. Okay, so Locrian moving to Dorian. And then from there, that Dorian, that sets me up to move down to the Ionian position and play another minor triad in the 1st inversion before relieving the tension to the 5 chord in the Locrian position. Now listen, if you don't know what I just said there, you're like, man, that sounded like Chinese to me or whatever it is. You need to call out the shapes. You need to sort to, you know, take the mental, the gray matter stuff and put it into a real world context on the fretboard. That's what's holding you back, is you can't just bring up this information instantaneously and be like, do this. I'm sorry. It sucks, but it's got to happen and you can take it from me. Right. And then of course, I move up to the 4th degree and I do another 1st inversion minor triad. Into a 2nd inversion diminished triad at the sharp 5. Again, another cadence there. Very interesting sound. Very interesting. And of course, that diminished allows me to then sneak up to the 6th degree, you know, using the root minor triad at Aeolian there, E. And that starts my sequence off, right? So then I jump down. Of course, I'm going to play A minor and B minor in the 1st inversion minor, right? So those are the actual arpeggios I play. A B minor, then I do an A minor. And from there, I'm going to probably jump down to Dorian. I think I do diminished at that point. Again, that's already exists there. And you already saw me basically evolve it from just the standard triad into the minor 7 flat 5 variant that already happens at Dorian too. So again, all of this information, foundational, you're like, I can do any one of these. I can play the simple version or I can go for the more sort of sophisticated version, or I can hybridize both or whatever it is that you need to do, right? But knowing that that happens there at the 2nd degree has got to be job number 1. And of course, from there, I'm just going to jump down and finish it off with essentially the 5-1 cadence at the very end. So you know, I don't want to sort of like go to town with this stuff. The big takeaway here is that you see me use the supervisory ideas, cadences and diatonic sequences. You see me look to move these sort of inversions around. I do 7 to 2 and then I do 1 to 7 because that creates just one loop there. And I could sit there and literally play those 4 arpeggios and get a killer workout just with that. But then I take it to the extreme and I jump up to the 4th degree and I play the sharp 5 too, and I start to mess around with it up there where it's a little bit more challenging because of the frets being a lot closer together and the fret markings not being quite so obvious, right? So there's that. And of course, after that, I'm like, oh, look, I can jump up and I can do a whole minor sequence using the diatonic scale theory. And I put those two ideas together and just... there it is, right? So that's what you should be doing too. It's not enough just to do the video. Come up with these exercises on your own and understand what it is that you're doing. You're like, this is a 1st inversion minor triad. This is a root triad. This is the 2nd inversion. Oh, look, this is diminished in the root. This is diminished in the 1st inversion. This is diminished in the 2nd or 3rd or whatever you want to call it. You know what I mean? Like, I don't care if you do it by scale degree, which is what I like to do. I'm like, it's at the 7th, it's at the 2nd, it's at the 4th, it's at the sharp 5, and it's back to the 7th again. That just keeps everything very simple and laid out on a grid. And then all I do is be like, if I move to the sharp 5 here, then I have to play this version of it. And if I move to the 4th degree, I have to play this one. And if I move down to the 2nd, I have to play this one, right? And that's, in my opinion, the superior way of learning it, because it just keeps things very simple. Just like move here, and then of course you can start to build out from there to really start to master the diminished sound, if you will. So let's get into this exercise and then we'll do a little chit chat about the improv at the end. Okay, with respect to the improv, obviously you can see me keeping it real. I don't really do the practice exercise with respect to the improv. Instead, I try to use diminished and conversely dominant 7 really when you get around to that in a musical way to create tension and release, to create a leaping off point for me to really exercise resolution, right? Because when you have these more sort of out there note sequences, let's put it that way, without getting too musically technical about it, it makes the more sort of standard stuff, like when you jump back into a major key or something like that, or the modes, sound that much more satisfying. So it's really an art form. I'm telling you right now, it takes a long time to practice, but you got to start by starting to mess around with the diminished in and of itself. And the other thing is like I said before, it's a Swiss Army knife. I do diminished in A major. I do it in D major. I do it in E major. So I'm borrowing diminished chords and triads and arpeggios, if you will, from each one of those keys while I'm playing over the bass note. And I do a couple key changes too, obviously, with respect to the scales, still using A major, D major, and E major. And I probably do other ones in there too. I think I do A melodic minor. I'm pretty sure I do. Right. Again, you can hear me using all of the elements. I have the diminished triad. I have the minor 7 flat 5. I have the melodic minor, all being lumped into the same sphere there to create that sort of really intense melodic sort of vibe that you get with diminished and the melodic minor and all that stuff. But then trying to balance it out, of course, with the major modes, which is really what you're looking for, that pushing and pulling, the yin and yang. So that's all I'm going to say about with, the sort of improv stuff. When you are practicing diminished in terms of an improv, don't do a practice exercise. Do that as a separate sort of like practice session. Instead, try to take one or two of these diminished shapes. Obviously, triads makes the most sense to start with, and start to work those in there based on whatever key you're playing, right? So if you're playing to a backing track in the key of A major, well, you can play diminished at the 7th degree. You can then move up to B, which is going to be the 2nd degree of A major, and do diminished there. Right? You can just keep following the pattern like we showed before in G major, but now starting off the 5th fret. And by starting to sort of incorporate those transitions, I think you'll find that you get so much more out of these arpeggios rather than just a boring practice exercise. So the practice exercise just breaks down the fretboard, but the real work happens when you start doing the improvisations and the jams, and you start to mess around with starting with diminished or using diminished in conjunction with the major or the minor, and trying to fit those two elements together. And you just keep refining, you keep getting closer and closer to the mark until boom, those two things, they fuse together. And all of a sudden you have this awesome new tool to use in your playing. So I hope this lesson helped, of course. If you have to, like I said, take the initiative and do what you need to do to sort of get these shapes under your fingers and get these sounds into your ears. That's also an incredibly important part of this lesson. It's something I did that made a monster difference. It will make a monster difference for you too. And you don't have to go crazy. Just start off with some basic stuff. It takes 2 minutes for you to basically grab, the fretboard diagram with the note names, look up the chord on the internet, and then plot it out on the neck itself. And I guarantee you, doing stuff like that will supercharge your learning experience. And then what used to take a year will take about a month. Done. Right. I think that about wraps it up. We'll see you in the next one.